And if you have any questions, I would be happy to respond.
Thanks so much, Alexei, for that brilliant presentation. I do want to call to your attention, for those of you who weren't taking meticulous notes, that a number of the concepts that Alexei discussed today were published in a piece called A New Era of Arms Control Myths, Realities, and Options by the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace on the 24th of November. So you should be able to find that online if you want to go back and to kind of read more carefully what Alexei has raised in his seminar. So I should also say that this is a rather atypical gathering. I think, as most of you know, but perhaps not everyone, we're not in session at the moment. This is our fall break. And so the people who I normally recognize automatically are not necessarily here. And so there's a mix, and I don't know many of you. So I'll try to not let that bias whom I select. I say Avner already has his hand up, so I'll go with somebody that I do know. But I want to encourage all of you, students, staff, friends, to ask questions. I may have to point if I don't recognize your face. But we have Professor Cohen. Go ahead.
Good to see you, Alexei. We met before quite a few times. I would like to have a few comments to what you have said. I agree with you very much about the diagnosis of the current situation and about the problem it raised. I think that you missed one important issue that I think should be seen as a problem. And that's the fact that arms control allow also socialization and a process of familiarity between the elite of the people in that field. That allows, in case of errors, in case of lack of understanding, to have some kind of informal connections. And the fact that we do not have that now is a problem. There are efforts to try to compensate by doing informal, even the top level at Omaha, looking for informal by academics, but it's not as good as and I think it's important to say. One thing that was almost totally missing from your talk, I think you mentioned it twice, and that's the word cyber. Many would say that the very emergence of cyber as it happened over the last 10, 15 years, and its impact on command and control system, put so much uncertainties. So in some ways it defies or overshadow the very process of arms control, because there is so much uncertainty about how cyber could be utilized, how the issue of entanglement, James Acton, the issue about that. So it was very much the emergence of that put aside the enormous arms control. So I would like to respond to that. And the final point that I'm curious to your reaction. This is the time that on the personal level, there is quite an unusual relationship between the two leaders of these two countries. I mean, Trump and Putin have some strange chemistry. And yet, at the institutional level of arms control, especially in the American side, there is almost a sense of disdain. It's not just structural problem, but almost a sense of disdain. And I wonder if you can say something about that.
Are we on the record?
We can edit out whatever you would like. We'll give you a chance to review the recording before we put anything online. So okay. We're off the record for the purposes of this particular set of questions.
Well, I couldn't agree more with your first proposition about the personal association and even friendship which developed during the 50 years of arms control with several generations and with a lot of continuity. The arms control has created a world arms control community, which probably many thousands of people. And the fact that now it is evaporating very quickly, both to natural reasons and because of the political situation, to my mind, is one of the probably the most serious aspect of the crisis of arms control. I agree with you. With respect to cyber, there are two opinions about nuclear deterrence. One is that uncertainty is a part of nuclear deterrence. You will not deliver first nuclear strike if you have a lot of uncertainty about the response of the other side. The other opinion is that nuclear deterrence, when it's mature nuclear deterrence, based on big history of arms control agreements, which actually enhanced nuclear deterrence during the last 50 years, any uncertainty is harmful. I belong to the second school. I think that uncertainty is bad for nuclear deterrence, or as I prefer to call it, nuclear stability, because strategic stability is based on nuclear deterrence. And it was formalized in Soviet-American Agreement of 1990. Strategic stability is a state of strategic relationships between the parties, which removes incentives for a first nuclear strike. I think this is a great definition, and I think we should keep it. Assumptions and arguments around this may be very different, and with the time change, they could change as well. But the very gist of strategic stability was formulated quite correctly, and I believe it's still relevant. So from this point of view, if cyber warfare, the cyber threat, creates uncertainty about nuclear deterrence, it is bad, and I agree with that. However, it is still, it has never been tested. It cannot be tested. It will remain uncertain. And we do not even know how does it particularly affect strategic stability. We could easily discuss and come to a joint opinion about how, for instance, precision-guided conventional weapons could affect strategic stability, or how space weapons could affect strategic stability, or how survivable mobile missiles could affect strategic stability. Because we have the frame of reference, we have experience, we have knowledge, it is predictable, we can easily talk about that and think about that. With the cyber, it is not possible. We do not know whether offensive cyber or defensive cyber will be ahead, and how long, and at which particular moment. We do not know whether cyber will affect more significantly first strike calculations or retaliation calculations. It could be easily argued that for the first counter-force strike, you have to have such a degree of command and control coordination and skills that even the minor cyber attack could thwart your attempts to deliver a counter-force strike. As with respect to retaliatory strike, it doesn't require that. You retaliate with what has survived, and you do not need any coordination in doing that, and you do not need much command and control. As long as your early warning systems have given you a warning, you are not. You can easily do what you need to do in a operation of retaliation. Maybe that is so. Maybe it is different. Maybe cyber can badly affect early warning systems. Then it would be bad for retaliation. But all those are opinions which are impossible to prove now and will be impossible to prove for the foreseeable future. So my point is, probably cyber warfare is detrimental to strategic stability. Presently, we do not understand how detrimental, and how can we do something about it, and how can we verify something about it. So, the fact that we cannot do anything with that does not mean that we are not interested in limiting and reducing nuclear weapons. Precision-guided conventional systems, hypersonic weapons, underwater nuclear torpedoes, and a lot of other things which are a threat to nuclear deterrence and strategic stability. So let's do what we can do, as we did in the past. during the previous 50 years. We managed to do a lot of important things, but not everything that we wanted. Let's be realistic and pragmatic. Let's go forward without waiting till for the time when it's clear, when we have clear idea about cyber effect and clear idea how to manage that. I could even suggest that now we could limit ourselves, confine ourselves to a politically binding declaration that we will refrain from cyber attacks against command and control systems of each other. And that would be easy to believe because neither side is interested in that. Because any kind of cyber meddling with command and control system could provoke spontaneous nuclear exchange. Nobody is interested in that. So that's as much as we can do for the foreseeable future, as far as I think. The last your question is the most fascinating and intriguing. We really are in a unique period in the history of our relations when relations between our leaders are good and relations between our states are very bad and getting worse. It's never happened before. And in the past, it was very often said about various leaders here and there in Soviet Union, Russia, that good relations between the leaders help relations between states. We cannot say it anymore. Good relations between Putin and Trump are detrimental to relations between Russia and the United States. Why does it happen? That's a point which could be a subject of a very long and very interesting discussion. I could give you just one version, a possible version of explanation. The fact that a large part of American society, an American establishment, does not like Trump, to put it mildly, does not like Trump, does not make his good relations with Putin his asset. And the fact that this same part of American establishment does not like Putin explains why on the American side good relations between leaders are not helping relations between states. On the part of Russia, most of those who like Putin like him not because of his friendship with Trump. They like him because he made Russia great again, because he did all he did during the last 10 years, which created such a bad attitude towards Putin and Russia in the West. And his friendship with Trump is not enhancing this attitude. Rather, it's detrimental. It's not an asset. It's a deficiency. Yes, it's a deficiency in the eyes of those who like Putin in Russia. In the eyes of those who do not like Putin in Russia, his friendship with Trump is not a great asset because they don't like Trump.
Thank you so much. Okay, I see Jessica. Why don't we take yours, Jessica?
Sure. I'm Jessica Barnum. I'm CNS's Deputy Director. And I'm curious about your thinking concerning next generation arms control approaches, assuming, and it's a very large assumption, that we can at some point bypass the toxic political environment to come to the table again. Historically, Cold War arms control was predicated on a certain amount of proportionality. This for a similar thing from you. Can we think of models of arms control that allow us to deal with some of the issues where we don't have equal things to exchange? And here I'm thinking specifically, for example, about tactical nuclear weapons in Europe, because there isn't an even exchange on the Russian side. Is there something that could be structured such that we give up some aspect of that in exchange for something else on the Russian side? And one of the reasons I wonder if this might actually become possible in the coming years is there's certainly an eagerness to have some political cover to remove tactical nuclear weapons from Turkey. I personally think the easiest way to do that is to remove all tactical nuclear weapons from Europe. Obviously, there's reasons on the US side when it comes to investment in next generation systems why there's bureaucracies that are resistant to that, but it seems like something that could be brought to the table by a future administration in exchange for something on the Russian side, but not tactical nuclear weapons, probably, because it's not an even equation.
Of course, in grand politics, there were trade-offs between very different things. For instance, when the START negotiations started, Americans were very interested in Soviet help to end the war in Vietnam. And that was part of the trade-off between Brezhnev and Nixon. Within arms control, also, there are some trade-offs between systems which are not subject of the same negotiation. Again, this example of first round of strategic arms control, Americans agreed to limit their ballistic missile defenses, and Russians agreed to limit their buildup of offensive missiles. And those were two different channels of negotiations, that not even within one channel of negotiations. So it happens. But I would not make this proposition too broad, because in principle, when we're dealing with technical things and with very dangerous technical things, usually you negotiate something according to those assumptions which I mentioned in my statement. Several assumptions which define whether a nation would agree or not agree to negotiate and to reach an agreement. With tactical nukes, if the United States withdrew tactical nukes from Europe, Russia certainly would feel strategically satisfied. But Russia cannot respond in kind, because even having more than the United States, it cannot withdraw somewhere. Withdrawing to Asia would certainly be met with a lot of frustration and negative feelings by our Asian allies, including China, and even by the United States, because we border not only in the Atlantic but also in the Pacific. Even in Pacific, we are even closer than in the Atlantic, Russia and the United States. So my proposition would be tactical nuclear weapons are not to be treated like strategic weapons, because they are not kept on permanent readiness status. They use dual-purpose delivery systems. So when you are talking about tactical nuclear weapons, you are not talking about placards or even launchers. You are talking about warheads, basically. Air gravity bombs, warheads of missiles, warheads of artillery shells, of various kinds of torpedoes and naval missiles, and so on. So you may agree, as a first step, to remove all tactical nuclear weapons from forward-based deployments of Air Force, Navy, Army, Marine Corps to centralized storages. Verification would be easier than trying to deal with system-to-system, weapon by weapon, because you will only have to verify that at forward bases there are no depots for tactical nukes. And nuclear weapons require specific, very stringent rules and systems of safety and security. And you can easily tell a depot of conventional warheads and weapons from a depot of nuclear weapons. Once they are removed to centralized storages, they will have to wait there before the time when we get down in our arms control progress to dismantling and safe utilization of nuclear warheads. We made several experiments of that in the past. Some of them were successful, in particular with uranium deal, getting uranium from warheads and selling them, blending and selling to the United States. But otherwise, it didn't go beyond experiments because it's very, very complex thing. Verification systems may compromise the most tightly held military secrets of either side, and that creates a difference. When presently, tactical nuclear weapons are kept in centralized storages together with strategic weapons that were removed from missiles, from bombers, put there in a reserve, or put there waiting for eventual dismantling and utilization. So let them stay there. And when the time comes, we will deal with them together with strategic warheads.
Thank you very much, Leslie. Please.
Hi, sir. Sean Baker, Navy Postgraduate School. You spoke a lot about treaties, interstate agreements, but prior to being enforced, these agreements have to go and be ratified by the respective countries, like Congress or the Duma. Could you please comment on the domestic will and political and among the people supporting such a new arms reduction treaty, or just in cooperation with the West in general?
In Russia?
Yes, sir.
In general, during the recent months or year, the public mood in Russia have been changing. And the Russians are now concerned about the threat of war, in particular nuclear war. And this fear is growing. That is shown by public opinion polls. It comes higher and higher, closer to people's concern about economic and social situation. With respect to Russian Parliament, which might have to ratify something reached between Russia and the United States at the executive level, there will be opposition in Russian Parliament, certainly, like it was in the 90s, when Russian Parliament was very different from the one which it is now. It was a real parliament, for better or for worse. It tried to impeach Yeltsin. It kept Start to Treaty for 7 years, not ratifying it. So it was a real parliament working as a parliament should work. Now it's very different. Although there will be opposition, certainly from nationalist parties, from communist parties, but the majority is strongly in the hands of the ruling party. And the ruling party is strongly in the hands of Putin, so there will be no problem in ratification. And the public in general will certainly support it.
Oh, please.
Большое спасибо for your presentation. It was very interesting. That is the extent of my Russian.
You want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure. I'm a student here doing the master's program. I'm from Zimbabwe. So you have a non-nuclear weapon state in the East. And I have a question. Basically, you mentioned the treaty limiting nuclear weapons, and you said it was not going to be useful because the non-nuclear weapon states have not signed up to it. But my concern, even from the myth that you decided to focus on, is this sort of insular tunnel vision where it's Russia, the United States, and maybe China, but the world is much bigger than that. And my concern is when you're talking about making concessions to get China to sign on to the INF treaty, we do have a legally binding treaty now, whether or not those countries are a member of it, but it has a normative effect, which is banning all nuclear weapons. So if you are now bargaining with another country to say, oh, okay, we'll let you increase your stockpiles to X amount so that we all have achieved parity. I feel like that's sort of missing the point of we're trying to move away from nuclear weapons as opposed to continuing to have them exist. So my question really was, I don't think at this point it's as easy to dismiss the rest of the world as it was, as you were saying before, during the Cold War in the 70s. So what is the consideration that goes into that, or is there none?
Pertaining to nuclear weapons or
Yes.
in general?
Well, basically I'm saying, despite the fact that the 9 nuclear weapon possessing states do not want to be part of this treaty, it exists, and it is creating a norm, whether they like it or not. So when we're talking about negotiating ways to bring China into treaties, etc., how can you ignore the fact that there is this thing that's there now, that wasn't there in the 70s when the negotiating started, or in the 80s when you're negotiating now?
I have great sympathy towards the motives of those who promoted the Nuclear Ban Treaty, which was adopted by the General Assembly in 2017. But I think that this treaty is not creating a norm for those who have not signed and ratified it. It is a norm which is hanging in the air. It's a norm for those who signed and ratified it. Those who didn't certainly should keep that in mind. And the best way to keep that in mind is to resume serious nuclear arms control. Not necessarily in line with this treaty, which may be a faraway goal. Maybe this treaty has designated the last station of this route. And if I were in place of the leaders of the nuclear weapon states and their representatives in the United Nations, I would say, thank you for doing this work. You did a great work, and we're grateful for this treaty. And we consider it as the final point of the process of arms control, which has to go forward through bilateral and eventually multilateral negotiations, and I've given you one of the possible illustrations of such, proceed forward, and that would be the roadmap between the present deplorable state of affairs and the final station of the United Nations General Assembly Treaty. Why it is not realistic? I promise to say a few words about that if you're interested. It's not realistic in my mind, not because it's bad or not well-intentional. It's unrealistic because it is treating nuclear disarmament as a technical problem and says how you reduce, how you dismantle, what procedures, what verification, and so on. But nuclear disarmament is only partly technical problem, but it's largely political and strategic problem. You cannot just cut it away from international relations like you may cut away malignant tumor from a living organism. The international relations, if tomorrow there were no nuclear weapons, by some miracle, nuclear weapons would come into chaos. For instance, how do those countries which are surrounded by very strong hostile neighbors, how do they survive? How do you provide security guarantees to your allies who are living close to very strong and potentially aggressive military powers? How do you make up for your lack of economic potential if you want to be a great power? Take, for instance, Russia, France, Britain. They want to remain great powers, but their economic potential is very small compared to that of the United States and China. They're trying to make up, in part, with nuclear weapons, in particular Russia, very openly, and France, tacitly, as well. So, going forward with nuclear disarmament has to be a gradual phased process in which, while making steps towards this goal, you are changing the international environment, reducing the role of nuclear weapons, reducing reliance of various states which have them on nuclear weapons, and removing the incentive for those who do not have them to acquire it. I think this is the only realistic way to go forward.
Okay, thank you, Alexei. I'm also tempted to weigh in on behalf of some of the non-nuclear weapon states, but I'm going to not do that at this moment. And maybe if we have occasion, we can return to this issue a little bit later. George?
Hi, I'm George Moore. I'm one of the scientists in residence. You mentioned that recent surveys of the Russian population have indicated that they fear war may be more likely. Can you expand on that a little bit? What's causing that fear? I mean, if it's economic, how is that tied to the prospect of war?
Well, the collapse of arms control treaties which were broadly discussed in mass media in Russia, the new weapon systems which are being developed by both Russia and the United States, they are perceived in the public in general as indications of the growing threat of war. And conflicts which are going on in various parts of the world, in particular Syria, Eastern Ukraine, Crimea, around Crimea, and the Middle East is a big region of violence and where great powers are involved. I think that affects public mood.
Thank you.
We had an interesting seminar both in Moscow recently and in Washington where Yelena Chernenko, who's I think a very talented analyst with Kommersant, presented a lot of the public opinion polls, and I'm pleased to share them with you if you're interested, George. We have some other questions, please.
Hi, thanks, Dr. Arbatov. My name is Ben Strug. I'm an interpreting student from the Defense Threat Reduction Agency, which is the agency that implements arms control treaties from the U.S. side. My question is about the verification mechanism, basically, which has its own benefits, just like the sort of elite level scholarly discourse between two countries. That verification mechanism also has its own positive fruits, I guess. So do you foresee any scenario where, possibly including China, sort of the verification mechanism could exist independent from the numerical limits? Basically, verification without numbers or something like that, or some other sort of low impact restriction that preserves the bilateral or multilateral sort of stabilizing effect of having this kind of regular business as usual verification regime ongoing.
Well, if we interpret the term strictly, verification is something with which you verify something. And what do you verify except provisions of arms control agreements? Confidence building measures is something different. Confidence building and transparency measures can exist without arms control reductions and limitations. And they do exist. And open skies is one of such things. But when it is sometimes suggested presently that even after expiration of the New START in March 2021, we could retain all those or many of those verification provisions, I very much doubt it. In fact, I'm sure it will not be possible, because all those, there are not a single verification provision or notification provision which is not very tightly connected to particular arms control provision. Ceilings, sub-ceilings, definitions of weapon systems, and so on. So I very much doubt that. And another observation is that openness about defense information in general has very different origins in the United States and in Russia or the Soviet Union. In the United States, this openness came with McNamara revolution in the Pentagon, when he tried to establish civilian control of the Pentagon over defense programs, in particular strategic nuclear programs, and then all defense programs. And then Congress was very strongly involved into this process. And a huge amount of information became available for public and for professionals, for experts, independent research centers. That was the origin of this openness of the United States. In the Soviet Union, it was very different. We didn't have McNamara in the Soviet Union. We didn't have civilian control over the defense policy. We had political control of the Communist Party leadership, but not civilian control. And in our case, the openness came only with arms control negotiations, because exchanging information with the other side presumed that that information was no longer secret, and eventually it became available to broad public and non-governmental centers, academic community, and so responding to our question, I think verification will not be possible.
Alex, if I could ask a question. I recall when the Russian Federation was promoting the idea of multilateralizing INF, and I always thought it was kind of a cynical initiative that was designed basically to diminish the INF treaty and because of opposition within Russia to INF. Today we have the United States promoting the concept of multilateralizing INF. And again, I guess my cynical explanation is they're interested in doing that because they see that as a way to justify the demise of the INF treaty. So I'm curious if you would share my cynicism with respect to both the Russian and the American drivers of this policy, or maybe the Russian case was very different from the American case today. Can you comment on that?
I do.
Okay, I won't pursue that publicly. We have time for probably another one or two more questions. I have my own, but I'd rather call upon others. Oh, yes, please, sir.
I'm Jacob Lunning. I'm also a student in the district course. I just have, it's kind of a hypothetical question, I guess, but what in your mind is really the very end goal of arms control? Because I'm sure we can all agree that the idea of the possibility of nuclear war wiping out biological life on Earth is very terrifying, but also the idea of returning to the regime of military conflicts prior to the advent of nuclear weapons is also kind of terrifying, especially considering all the increases in the lethality of conventional weapons that have occurred in the last little over a half century. So I was just wondering what your opinion on that is.
Well, my opinion is quite banal. I think that nuclear arms control should not make the world safe for conventional conflicts and big conventional wars. So by proceeding with nuclear arms control, you have to make sure that you also cover other important issues. And that's exactly what happened when the arms control had its golden age. It was very successful. After the INF Treaty came not START 1. After INF Treaty came Conventional Force Reductions Treaty in Europe, which drastically reduced the level of conventional forces, which in its own turn made possible not only START 1, but also bilateral, politically binding deep reductions of tactical nuclear weapons from European continent, which were reduced by an order of magnitude both by the Soviet Union and by the United States. So that is my answer. And in a more general sense, certainly nuclear-free world is not the present world minus nuclear weapons. It's a world built on very different norms and mechanisms and institutions which would provide for peaceful resolution of conflicts, which would provide security to small and weak states and so on.
Thank you. Alexei, when I introduced you about an hour and a half ago, I compared you to the great Italian cinematographer Federico Fellini. I think after hearing about the dangers and the horrors that now await us in the arms control sphere, I'm more inclined to compare you to Alfred Hitchcock. I hope there's a happy ending to this story, and I think while you have kind of charted us in the direction of what needs to be done, of course the real difficulty is persuading our political leaders to pursue that course as well, and we look to you to give us more guidance in that regard in the future. Please join me in thanking academician Alexei Arbatov.